Hi. So I'm Garnet Hertz, and I'm talking to Gentry Sayers at University of Victoria. I am at Emily Carr University of Art and Design in Vancouver. And we're having a conversation related to making. So Gentry, what do you, so first tell me about what you're doing at University of Victoria and
Yep.
and what you're interested in and the lab that you have there.
Yeah. So my research interests are basically hover around comparative media studies. I do work primarily in the late Victorian period and the early modernist period, so 19th and early 20th century, looking at the role of old media, analog media, dead media, and the production and distribution of culture, the enabling of culture at those periods. With specific interests in sound technologies, early magnetic audio recording, for example. What I do here at the University of Victoria, on the teaching side, I teach at the undergraduate level a series of courses in digital studies that combine things like programming, tactile media, gaming, with theory in that area. So it's kind of a cultural criticism meets applied approaches and to technologies. And then I also teach 20th century U.S. fiction. And at the grad level, I teach a seminar, which I usually call Arguing with Computers, which was about how do cultural studies alongside questions of computation, again, from that kind of applied perspective. The lab I direct, called the Maker Lab, or what we just generally refer to as the M Lab, has two sites, a prototyping site and a fabrication site. The fabrication site is quite new, and what we do there is we build kits for people to better understand inaccessible technologies, so technologies that we can no longer have at hand. They no longer work. They may have never existed, and we prototype them for use in circulation using physical computing techniques and fabrication techniques.
So how do you tie that? So I mean, it's kind of a curious overlap that you have between historical work that you're doing in comparative media and English, and then this this stuff that you could term as like maker culture type of work. So I mean, so how did you initially get? How do you see the interplay between the hands-on stuff and the written components of your work?
Yeah, I try to mix them or kind of overlap them as much as possible, but sometimes that is quite difficult. One of the things I think about the KITS project in particular, the Kits for Cultural History in the lab, is what it does is it takes, I think, a lot of the work that, say, Matthew Kirschenbaum has done, Wendy Chun has done, Tara McPherson has done on the relationship between conceptual treatments of media and their like material particulars, so how they were made, how people use them, how we can, to the best of our ability, recover things like interface or recover things like storage and memory over time. And the way that shaped my writing, say going back and prototyping technologies that are, again, may have never been made or are no longer accessible, is to give me and the people I work with a better sense of how this became that, borrowing from Matthew Fuller. So the sense that maybe a lot of the archival work I would do, looking at documentation, looking at photographs, looking at depictions in fiction of these technologies, I think is enriched by kind of more material understanding of their composition, especially around when technologists, engineers often pitch technologies that may have never actually worked or were maybe never manufactured in the way that they suggested in the documentation, right? So another thing that we look at too is things like laboratory notebooks and documentations of experiments to see if they would have actually manifested in the way that was purported. There's always some anachronism there, right? There's always going to be some slippage in history. We can't inhabit the world like they did then, even if we were there then. That's an impossibility. But I still think it's worth a shot. So that's generally how it works over is taking the writing beyond process documentation, right, and saying, okay, well, how does these laboratory experiments, these experimental methods, how can we actually flesh them out as forms of arguments using the prototypes that we build over time.
So for those prototypes, are those prototypes the endpoint of what you're doing, or do you then write about those artifacts? Like, for example, do the artifacts exist as art or design objects, or like do you exhibit those and see those as an endpoint in themselves, or do you typically write up this summary of you building it and then working with it and then having that re-inform maybe the historical document, or how do you handle that or navigate that?
At the moment, yeah, I wouldn't say anything we're making is art. I don't have that much confidence in the work, or that much hubris. But I do think we are considering ways that we could exhibit them. I think we've been talking, for example, some practitioners over in the East Coast at Rutgers about having an exhibit around these kind of kits and this kind of more object-driven humanities research. But I wouldn't treat them as art objects. So I think we're still in a kind of a liminal period for figuring out where they will go. One thing that interests me is being able to think about the circulation of things like models and schematics and instructions via things like GitHub and online. To see if they could be picked up and reused by others. But again, this is the second year of the project, so we're not far along enough to see what the actual ripple effects may be. But we are quite interested in the idea of encouraging reuse, repurposing of the things that we make, and to see how, if at all, they work their way back into, say, scholarship, even archives, memory institutions. We'll see.
Right.
But right now the aims are modest.
Right. And so coming out of that, like, what was the decision to start up a lab called the Maker Lab? Did it just seem like a good strategy in terms of the positioning of the university or the department, or actually, that's maybe a different topic, but I'm actually interested more in your take on the maker movement. Mm-hmm. And by that I mean like Make Magazine, Maker Faire, hacker spaces, 3D printing, Arduino, this sort of thing. Where do you see what do you make of the maker movement?
Yeah, so I mean, my personal background is in I was at VCU as an undergrad, Virginia Commonwealth University as an undergraduate, and I did a lot of work there actually prior in high school, and DIY zines, with music, playing in bands, booking shows, running nonprofit venues, and so that's actually where I see that kind of DIY culture as being a locus, that legacy. So people making their own tangible or tactile media, cutting their own records, booking their own shows, running their own tours, kind of not necessarily controlling the means of circulation, but having a particular audience in mind, and an audience that may not be the target audience for large, major labels or major presses or what have you. So people that have taken it upon themselves to kind of create the media they wanted to see in the world, and start circulating it. So that's where I kind of start with that work, and it's influenced some of my pedagogy as well. So teaching video games as zines, building on Anna Anthropy's work, for example. Yeah. In terms of the lab's relation, in my own relation to Make Proper, Make the brand, Maker Faire, it's relatively distant, I'd say. So we read up on some of the publications. We'll occasionally check in, look at things that they're publishing online or what have you, especially physical computing materials, which are often helpful. But primarily for things like tutorials and what others are doing, we're less interested in the kind of a form of hobbyism that seems to be the area of interest of Make, and especially the kind of individualism and kind of bootstraps ethos that Make tends to have, not always, but tends to have, just doesn't really appeal to us. We're more kind of collectively oriented. That said, there are a lot of maker spaces and hack spaces across the U.S. and Canada that have influenced us. Bill Turkell's work at Western, Matt Ratto's work, of course, at Toronto, your work, places like the Attic in Seattle, Double Union in San Francisco, that start with the claim that many of these, not all of them, but that what you already know is enough. in these fields, and actually building on personal history and biography and personal experience for things like academic research can actually be quite suggestive and for lack of a better word, creative. As opposed to the often, I see this a lot in a lot of humanities research, like, oh, I got to learn programming, or I've got to learn to code in order to do, proper digital research, right? So, asking people in the lab, like, what's your background? Like, what have you worked with? And I've learned things, for example, like some of the people there are like impeccable at drawing and illustration, which I would have never known, right? Or I had a background in carpentry, never knew that, right? So the things that come out in the list and the calls for new researchers will often mask or elide the kind of personal histories that I think are really relevant. So it's not so much a space based on lack, a research space based on lack, but what people already know and how we can work together from there. So yeah, I think the model and culture is what we've used from make cultures or maker cultures broadly, but we don't really feel like a lot of what you would see in Make Magazine is something we're speaking to directly. It's more of a peripheral relationship.
Right. And what's the reaction been in putting in a laser cutter and CNC milling machine and 3D printers and physical computing stuff into English department?
Yeah, I mean, my sense is that it's been overall pretty positive. We've gotten a lot of interest from various groups on campus. So CFUV, we've worked with them for workshops. That's our local radio station. In particular, their women's collective. We've also talked quite a bit across the faculty, so in computer science and English, more generally for the humanities faculty about our research. We go to conferences, we present the research. The department's always helpful in publishing updates on their own website, and of course we've gotten infrastructural and other forms of support from the humanities faculty and from the English department. Where the fabrication space is where that's happening and where that's being developed, it wouldn't have been possible without support from visual arts, actually. So the Faculty of Fine Arts and specifically the Department of Visual Arts partnered with us to make that space happen, the space where the laser cutter and some of our CNC machines are, and specifically Paul Wall, the chair there. So I can't really imagine now, either in hindsight or in the future, the lab's research working without students in fine arts and faculty in fine arts. So we always have, for instance, at least one MFA student on our research team each year. So yeah, again, I think it's been pretty positive. I think the work is relatively communicable, even if it's kind of idiosyncratic or, again, kind of marginal to what a lot of humanities researchers do. But given the fact that the university has such a background in digital humanities, the Humanities Computing and Research Center, for example, the Electronic Textual Cultures Lab, projects like the Modernist Versions Project, faculty like Ray Siemens, for example, who really laid the groundwork. They've been very welcoming to what I've done.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So what do you make of the term critical making? Like I've seen you, are you familiar with the term, or do you have any thoughts on it or any relationship to other related terms like critical design, reflective design, speculative fiction, design fiction, values in design? Do you frame your work within any of these terms, or do you find any of those things useful, or do you have maybe some different terms that you use to construct and position your work?
Yeah, I think when I first came across that term, it was Matt Ratto's early publication on it, and the use of it for prototyping and making arguments about, or making theoretical gestures and arguments via objects and through objects, and testing them and reiterating them. I'm keen on the term. It's not something we always necessarily use in the lab, but it's definitely shaped our thinking. I think where most of that work comes from is somewhere the notion of design or making in the lab would be somewhere at the intersection of comparative media studies and science and technology studies. So I can't imagine the work, for example, emerging without some of the early research I did around boundary objects, Bowker and Starr's work around that idea. So how do objects help us understand not only where boundaries are drawn, differences happen, but also things persist. There's sameness. There's things like ideology and consistency in use with objects. So sorting things out, for example, and Starr's early work, and I think it was with zoos and museum spaces, is quite interesting to me. So that's kind of where it started, was with boundary objects, and then Wendy Chun's work in particular around governmental technologies. So looking specifically at how technologies have an architecture that can be studied, not just as things that are necessarily value-laden or what they enable, but actually how they're built and what the construction of those means for the production of subjects, right? So how in computation subjects can be interpolated and individuated, but at the same time have a sense of like agency and freedom in her work, especially lately in program visions. So it's kind of blending those two, and increasingly, at least in digital humanities, looking at work by Carrie Krauss around speculative fiction, design fiction, and her idea of kind of long-term design, that kind of long now idea that you see with Brand and others, and thinking about that in particular, so the relationship between objects and temporality, and what actually making and prototyping objects, she's in an information school in English, making and prototyping objects can do for areas of humanities thinking. Others have been Bethany Nowitzki's work at the Scholars Lab, speculative computing, for sure, with Johanna Drucker, Jerry McGann early on. So the idea of a kind of more subjective form of computation where people insert themselves into the system they're studying rather than kind of detaching themselves from it. So gaming, for example, is central, but the Scholars Lab generally has gone into things like fabrication, and physical computing is another area of research. And yeah, just the list really goes on. I've followed some of the design fiction work. I'm doing a graduate seminar in design fiction, but kind of twisting it a little bit to make it more historical. So for example, what's the long history between like writing as design in design fiction? So looking at, say, the production of literary and artistic movements, and how they would often have like an ism that was associated with not only what they believed in, their ideology, their belief system, but how they wanted their work to appear. So things like imagism, symbolism, futurism, how that work was designed, and how it could be rethought today as a form of design fiction.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a handful of things that we've looked into. But again, it's generally somewhere at the intersection of comparative media and science and technology studies.
Right. And in terms of objects, I mean, what do objects have? And I'm glad that you raised the idea of boundary objects, because I think that's important for people to understand and know about. What do objects have that writing doesn't for you?
I think it's, I mean,
what do you gain out of, what do you or the students that you work with think that you gain out of getting dirt under your fingernails?
Yeah. Yeah, so that's a tough one. I think our default position would be that objects are always just kind of congealed or frozen process, right? So it isn't to create things that we then fetishize, or we make arguments that they're kind of withdrawn from us, that objects are completely unknowable. This kind of ontology doesn't necessarily fascinate the lab. I think what they do for us is they're a way of, I'm thinking of Terry McPherson's work in Cinema Journal in 2009, where you can talk about, in media studies, the idea that a lot of media work has been about the object of inquiry rather than through it. And I think once you start making objects through the media, you have a better understanding of several things. One of them would be their situatedness in time. So what could have worked then, again, historical works, in our case, often, well over 100 years. So what could have worked then? How did the imagination function then? What were things like, especially for a lot of our work, the gender and social politics of the time? So who were these objects intended for? How are they meant to be worn? How is innovation, for example, gendered and manifested through things like exhibitions of work? but also, as I mentioned earlier, kind of resisting an overly conceptual treatment or an overly theoretical treatment of objects by getting in and better understanding, again, without the assumption that you fully understand it or comprehend it. We're not interested in, say, exact reproductions of history. That's not it's just not our investment. You can get a better sense of what goes into those objects. Forms of labor, for example. One of our kits is about early wearables in the 1860s, 1870s. So jewelry pieces that were animated through electromagnetism. And there we've learned a lot about that I think I would have ignored otherwise, about the role that clockmaking played, the role that the early telegraph played, the telegraph sounder in particular, but also developments in fashion at the time that weren't really, at least at that moment, neatly overlapping with the kind of electromagnetic worldview that was popular in the late Victorian period and certainly popular in the early 20th century. So these forms of labor, these forms of embodiment that I think would otherwise get ignored or risk being ignored, I'm not saying they always are, but can be, is important. And really basically in the example of the kits, the early wearables work that we've been doing, I've seen some people that are doing that work. Carolyn Marvin, for example, there's Ryan's recent book on Garments of Paradise, where these objects are briefly mentioned, but they're kind of, because we don't have them at hand, there's not a lot known about them. No one's really written on them significantly. And I think actually trying to prototype them, we figured out all of these other different relationships, largely again around social relations and labor, that would have been ignored in the scholarship. So yeah, hopefully that helps. The other thing I'd mention pedagogically that I find curious about working with objects is students will spend an inordinate amount of time, and I'm not always sure this is a good thing, trying to get it to work. Right? Whereas often in an essay, they'll be like, all right, I've done what I can. I know this isn't going to be published at the end of the semester or whatever, but there's something about design work. There's, physical computing work, for example, or, programming where they want it to work before they submit it. And so there's this kind of different impulses around what it means to complete something, or what it means to function, what it means for an object compared to a piece of writing to function properly, which I find interesting. So melding the two and putting them together, I think is productive.
Interesting stuff. Okay. Thanks for talking. I think that's great. And that's really fascinating. And I think there's a lot more that we could talk about, but I think that's good for now.
All right, cool. Thanks.
All right.
Yeah.